Hi everyone, and welcome to the MIM Virtual Conference 2019. My name is Paul Jocelyn. This is the second of two videos that I've produced as part of this year's Expo. I'm also involved in the broader MIM leadership program, so hopefully what we cover in these two videos really starts to resonate with you and you'll come back and join me for the broader program. In the first video that I prepared for this year's Expo, we talked about the role of major incident managers in terms of change leadership. So just to recap, lots of great support on the Expo, of course, around your technical capabilities, lots of great examples and case studies that should inspire you to be ever more competent and proficient and confident. But of course, an emerging challenge and an emerging opportunity is your role as that of a leader within your organization across the IT piece, but also, of course, more broadly for the business as a whole that you seek to serve. In the first video, we spent some time thinking about change leadership and in particular psychological safety. So how can you as a change leader create the right environment, a psychologically safe environment where your team can really thrive? And we focused on three areas there. How do you create clear context for the challenges and the change you seek to make? How do you create better connections within your team and across the organization? And then thirdly, how do you start to make change happen as a result? And that really linked neatly into the idea of continuous learning and how do you create a continuous learning culture within your team? How could that role model beyond into the rest of the IT function? And of course, again, out to the organization more broadly. So in this second video, we're going to spend some time thinking a little bit more deeply around the ideas of continuous learning and continuous learning culture, with hopefully some practical tips that you can take back to your team and start to test and start to implement as you look to build out that feature of your group. So it's fair to say that continuous learning culture has been a real ongoing challenge for organizations for many, many years. And I think before we get into a number of ideas and potential tools and tactics, it's worth just positioning where learning and training specifically has come from historically for many, many businesses. Of course, it started in the factory. The idea that business value was created by scaling efficiency and optimizing process. And so the role of learning and training was to ensure that the constituent parts, the human parts of the process were really, really clear on their role, really clear on what was expected in terms of delivering a particular process. And as a result, when we link all of that capability together, we strive and scale optimization. So the idea for training as compliance is a really deep-rooted historical idea. I think it's fair to say in the complex, disrupted organizations of today and the rate of change that we see, some of that training mindset is no longer as applicable. Now, of course, there are a number of fixed processes that we wouldn't want to find many different ways of interpreting and twisting and turning to suit ourselves. It's absolutely right that there are a number of processes where we would want absolute compliance. But in terms of creating value and leading effective teams, I think we're seeing a shift towards continuous learning and looking ahead and putting more responsibility into the hands of our teams to take on that responsibility rather than relying solely on training that's delivered from above in a more linear way. I think it doesn't really reflect the way that individuals and organizations expect or do learn in practice today. So in terms of learning culture, again, we'll look at 4 or 5 ideas, tools and tips that I think you could take away, reflect on, and start to implement with your teams. So the first of those would be very simply, how can you adopt a habit of asking but why questions? How can you start to introduce that into your conversation? How can you create more of a question, action, reflection loop in the conversations that you lead? And that may be quite simply starting to test and trial that in your one-to-one conversations with individual team members. It might be introducing that as a part of the process or even the agenda for your team meetings. So simply adopting and grooving a habit of why questions, understanding the bigger picture, understanding context, understanding where connections are being made or not made, is a really simple change leading habit, and one that you can adopt quite quickly. And in my experience, where a leader starts to do that, it can have a really positive ripple effect, because the barriers go down and your team members themselves feel more comfortable and more open to start to copy that behavior, which I think is a win-win. That's really positive. Secondly, is a really simple approach for continuous learning through shadowing others. How can you create opportunities for you and your team members to spend some planned time with other members of the organization? So again, we talk in the first video around the power of better connections. How can you take that one stage further to encourage learning through seeing, and learning through questioning, and learning through observing and reflecting and challenging and testing and taking on other roles in other parts of the organization upon which you depend? Really simple, really quick, doesn't need lots of administration or even planning, certainly doesn't cost anything in my experience, but the opportunity to shadow in order to seek new ideas and open up new questions can be invaluable. Thirdly, to build on that, if we think about you as a major incident manager and your team members, the opportunity to volunteer for other cross-functional projects in the right time, in the downtime, as it were, is again absolutely invaluable. Simple, quick, no cost or low cost. How can you create the habit and the rhythm to be part of, wherever you can, cross-functional programs and cross-functional projects? How can you bring that curiosity and questioning? How can you see that as an opportunity to get under the skin of how other parts of the organization work, that allow you to then serve them better when the need arises? So again, contextual, building understanding, building the bigger picture, connecting dots, really important, really simple. So if we think about the questioning and the observing through shadowing others in other parts of the organisation, the opportunity to volunteer for those cross-functional projects, the fourth piece I'd say is, how do you as a leader create opportunities for your team to apply that learning? How do you give them space consciously to reflect on what they've seen or what they've heard or what they've learned, what they've observed, what they've been able to experience, and put that into practice? How can you put them on the hook to bring it into their work? How can you enable them and expect them and work together to turn it into something practical? How can you structure their plans? How can you structure their objectives? How can you structure the way that you set up the work to ensure that there's a real connection between the ideas that they've gathered, the opportunities that they've taken, the new things they've seen and reflected on, and actually turn that into something practical? Because the risk that you need to be aware of is, if you open out those opportunities, whether that's observation, whether that's shadowing, but you aren't seen to allow them to put some of those challenges or theories or new learning into practice, then people very quickly lose faith, of course. So it's really important to connect those two together. And then the fifth and the final tip that I would suggest is, How do you create feedback loops? How do you create, again, that habit of idea, reflection, action, and feedback? How do you join that circle? So again, in practical terms, that might be introducing feedback into those one-to-one conversations, introducing feedback loops and opportunity as part, again, of team meetings. How do you introduce feedback loops, that expectation as part of your stakeholder conversations, part of those ongoing meetings, part of those planning meetings, part of those all important after action review meetings? So this is an expectation at all levels. Again, that habit forming piece that says, in the way that we think about asking the why questions as that first example, that first tool and tactic, this is the fifth tactics. How do we bring that feedback loop as something that we become famous for in the organization? It just becomes a positive habit, forming a habit that constantly moves you forward. So hopefully some interesting and applicable tips there. Let's just recap again. Number one, we're looking to build this continuous learning culture, simply asking why questions, thinking about building those in to our interactions, forming that as a positive habit. Secondly, opportunities to shadow others. As we talked in the first video, context is king. How do we get out of our own heads? How do we take opportunities to observe, to ask questions, to reflect, to seek, to come up with new ideas by being closer to where the real work happens, as it were? Third tip, volunteer, cross-functional work. There's gold dust there. How do we put ourselves forward for the projects at which we understand connections between teams? How do we always look to be part of that because it's invaluable? Thirdly, always think about creating opportunities for your team to apply the learning that they've gained, where we've opened up opportunities for them to seek and sense and take responsibility. How do we bake it back into plans and projects so that those two actions can connect together to make great change happen? And then finally, as we just said, creating that feedback loop, that expectation across every conversation post. We're always looking to join the dots, reflect, and think about what might be next. So hopefully some interesting tips and some things for you to think about, all in the context of change. Again, as per the first video, I'd love to hear your reflections, hear your feedback, take any questions. So feel free to pose those through the MIM leadership team. And I really look forward to working with you again as part of that broader leadership program. I hope you enjoy the Expo this year. It's been great to spend time with you today. Good luck. See you very soon.